Get out. Everything that belongs to me stays with me. The lawyers will handle the rest.
Get out. The words hit Marshall OA harder than any financial loss ever could. His wife stood at the top of the staircase, divorce papers in one hand and the prenup she had written herself in the other. Everything that belongs to me stays with me, Simone said coldly. The lawyers will handle the rest. Marshall stared at her. 23 years of marriage had just been reduced to a stack of papers. 11 days earlier, he had been worth over $2 billion. 11 days earlier, people fought for a seat at his table. Now the company he had spent 22 years building was gone. His business partner had stolen hundreds of millions through a scheme hidden beneath layers of paperwork. The banks had seized his assets. Investors had disappeared. Friends had stopped calling. And now his wife was leaving too. Marshall looked toward his son Dorian, hoping for something. Anything. A word. A question. A reason to stay. But Dorian never looked up from his phone. That hurt more than everything else. Because at that moment Marshall understood something terrible. He had not just lost his fortune. He had lost his family. Hours later, he walked out of the Greenwich mansion, carrying a single suitcase. No reporters waited. No friends called. No one followed him. The man who once owned private jets and luxury properties across multiple states now had only $3,200 left in a forgotten checking account. That was all. $3,200. A lifetime of work reduced to a number smaller than some people spent on a weekend vacation. 6 months later, Marshall sat alone on a weathered bench in Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem. Every afternoon, he came to the same spot. Every afternoon, he watched people pass. And every afternoon, he wondered where everything had gone wrong. The expensive suit he still wore no longer fit the life he lived. The jacket was wrinkled. His beard was unshaven. His shoes were scuffed. Nobody recognized him anymore. Nobody cared. Then something unusual happened. A food cart rolled slowly down the pathway. The smell of fried chicken, onions, and spices drifted through the air. The woman pushing the cart suddenly froze. Her eyes widened. She stared at Marshall as though she had just seen a ghost. For several seconds, she didn't move. Then she whispered a name. Marshall Oye. Marshall looked up. Their eyes met. He had never seen her before. At least he thought he hadn't. But the woman knew exactly who he was. 10 years earlier, one act of kindness from Marshall had completely changed her life, and she had never forgotten it. What Marshall didn't know was that the meal she was about to place beside him would expose a massive fraud, restore everything he had lost, and give him something far more valuable than money. Something money had never been able to buy. Welcome to Super Stories. Tell us where you're watching from. USA, Canada, UK, Australia, South Africa, Nigeria, or anywhere else in the world. Marshall watched as a woman opened a container and carefully filled it with fried chicken, rice, and beans. The smell alone made his stomach tighten. He had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Still, he didn't reach for it. The woman placed a container beside him on the bench. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finally, Marshall looked up. I think you've mistaken me for someone else. The woman smiled. No, she said. I'm sure I haven't. Marshall frowned. Do I know you? She shook her head. Not really. That answer only confused him more. The woman wiped her hands on her apron. My name is Nain Thibodeau. The name meant nothing to him. She seemed to expect that. 10 years ago, she continued, I was selling fried chicken from a folding table in New Orleans. Marshall searched his memory. Nothing. Nain laughed softly. You bought 1 plate. Still nothing. You stood on the sidewalk and ate every bite. Marshall looked embarrassed. I've eaten in a lot of places. I know, she replied. Then her smile faded. At the time, I had $40 left in the world. Marshall looked at her more carefully. My daughter hadn't eaten since the previous day. Something in her voice made him pay attention. You bought 1 meal, she continued. Then you changed my life. Marshall stared at her. What are you talking about? Nain sat beside him. The next week, a lawyer called me. Marshall's eyebrows lifted. He told me someone had paid for 6 months of rent at the French market. Now Marshall's expression changed. A distant memory surfaced. A small food stand. A little girl with a coloring book. A woman trying desperately to keep her business alive. Suddenly he remembered. Barely, but he remembered. Nain saw it in his eyes. "There it is," she said quietly. Marshall looked down at the food container. "I didn't think you'd ever know it was me." "I didn't," Nain replied. "Not until today." She pointed at him. "You've changed." Marshall almost laughed. "That obvious?" Nain nodded. "You used to walk like you owned the world." Marshall looked away. "Turns out I didn't." For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of children playing echoed across the park. A dog barked in the distance. Someone rode past on a bicycle. Life continued moving around them. Meanwhile, Marshall felt as though his own life had stopped months ago. Nain noticed a sadness in his eyes. "Eat," she said gently. Marshall hesitated. Then he opened the container. The first bite hit him like a memory. Warm, comforting, real. For the first time in months, he tasted something that wasn't rushed, packaged, or forgettable. Nain watched him take another bite. Then another. And for the first time since losing everything, Marshall felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. As the sun began to set behind the trees, Nain stood and pushed her cart back onto the pathway. Before leaving, she looked at him and smiled. "Same time tomorrow." Marshall watched her disappear down the path. He looked at the empty food container in his hands. For reasons he couldn't explain, tomorrow suddenly seemed worth showing up for. And neither of them knew that a discovery hidden inside an old hard drive was about to destroy the man who stole Marshall's fortune and change all of their lives forever. The next afternoon, Marshall arrived at the bench 15 minutes early. He told himself it was because he had nowhere else to be, but deep down he knew the truth. He was hoping to see the food cart again. At exactly 4 o'clock, it appeared. The same white cart. The same smell of fried chicken and spices. The same woman pushing it with steady hands. Nain smiled when she saw him. "You came." Marshall shrugged. "I was already here." Nain laughed. "Of course you were." She handed him a container before he could refuse. This time he opened it immediately. Nain noticed. Neither mentioned it. For several days, this became their routine. She arrived. He ate. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in silence. Oddly enough, Marshall began looking forward to the silence most. For months, every conversation in his life had been about loss. Lawyers, creditors, reporters, investigators. People asking what happened. People asking what he would do next. Nain never asked. She simply showed up, and somehow that mattered more. On the 7th day, Nain finally asked the question, "What really happened?" Marshall stared at the ground. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then something inside him broke open. Maybe it was the weeks of loneliness. Maybe it was the fact that she wanted nothing from him. Whatever it was, the words started coming. He told her everything. About Vernon Ashford. About the hidden loans. About the luxury developments he never approved. About the personal guarantees buried inside hundreds of pages of legal documents. About the banks. The lawsuits. The bankruptcy. The divorce. The son who stopped calling. The night spent staring at a ceiling in a tiny room wondering who he was without his company. Nain listened quietly. She never interrupted, never judged, never offered advice. When Marshall finally finished, the sun was beginning to disappear behind the buildings. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Nain asked a question so unexpected that Marshall blinked. "Do you still have the records?" "The records?" "The company records." Marshall frowned. "What records?" "The financial documents. Reports. Contracts. Loan files. Everything." Marshall nodded slowly. "I kept copies." "Why?" He gave a sad smile. "Because I didn't know what else to do." "Where are they?" "In my room." Nain leaned back. "Good." Marshall looked confused. "Good." She nodded. "Because I know someone." Marshall raised an eyebrow. "Someone who can help?" "No," she said. "Someone who can find the truth." For the first time in months, Marshall felt something stir inside him. A tiny spark. A possibility. What kind of person is this? Nain smiled. The kind of person who spends his life following money. Marshall stared at her. The park suddenly seemed quieter. The air felt different. What if the truth doesn't change anything, he asked. Nain looked directly at him. Then at least you'll know you didn't lose everything, because you deserve to. Marshall sat motionless. Nobody had said that to him before. Not the lawyers. Not the banks. Not even his family. The possibility that he might actually be a victim, and not a failure, had never occurred to him. Nain stood and grabbed the handles of her cart. Tomorrow morning. Where? Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. Marshall looked up. Who's this person? Nain smiled as she started pushing the cart away. A man who hates thieves. Marshall watched her disappear down the path. For the first time in 6 months, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what might still be waiting to be found. And somewhere across Manhattan, the man who stole hundreds of millions of dollars was enjoying dinner, completely unaware that the first crack had just appeared in the wall protecting him. He had no idea his empire was about to begin collapsing. The next morning, Marshall stood outside a small brick building on Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. It was nothing like the offices he used to visit. No marble lobby, no security desk, no glass conference rooms overlooking Manhattan. Just a faded sign that read, Clarence Abrams, forensic accountant and attorney. Marshall glanced at Nain. You're sure about this? Nain adjusted the food container she was carrying. No. Marshall looked surprised. No. She smiled. I'm sure about him. Before Marshall could respond, she pushed open the door. The office was small. Books lined every wall. Boxes of files sat stacked in corners. A fan turned slowly overhead. Behind a cluttered desk sat a gray-haired man, wearing reading glasses on a chain around his neck. Clarence Abrams, 62 years old. Sharp eyes, sharper mind. He looked up, then looked at the food container in Nain's hand. You brought chicken? Extra hot sauce, too. Clarence grinned. Then whatever problem you have gets 20 minutes. Marshall almost laughed. It was the first genuine smile he'd had in months. A few minutes later, the hard drive was connected to Clarence's computer. Marshall sat quietly while Clarence scrolled through thousands of files. Loan agreements, investment reports, fund allocations, internal memos, emails, financial statements. The room became silent, except for the clicking of a mouse. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Clarence stopped smiling. 30 minutes later, he removed his glasses, then put them back on, then leaned closer to the screen. Marshall noticed the change immediately. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Finally, Clarence looked up. What exactly were you told happened? Marshall explained the collapse, the bad investments, the failed developments, the market downturn, everything the lawyers had told him. Clarence listened. Then he shook his head. No. Marshall frowned. No what? No market downturn caused this. Marshall sat forward. What do you mean? Clarence tapped the screen. This wasn't business failure. The room went quiet. Nain folded her arms. She already knew what was coming. Marshall felt his pulse quicken. Clarence pointed at several files. These allocations were altered. Another file. This signature authorization was changed. Another. This project never existed. Marshall stared at him. What? Clarence clicked another document. Then another. Then another. Every file seemed to reveal something worse. Shell companies. Hidden transfers. Fake developments. Money moving through layers of accounts. Millions disappearing. Year after year. Clarence slowly leaned back. His expression had become deadly serious. Marshall? What? This wasn't incompetence. Marshall's stomach tightened. This was theft. The words hit harder than any bank notice. Harder than the divorce papers. Harder than the bankruptcy. Theft. Not failure. Not bad luck. Not poor decisions. Theft. Clarence pointed at the screen. Someone deliberately built this system. Marshall's voice dropped. Vernon. Clarence nodded. Vernon. The room became silent again. Marshall stared at the documents. For 6 months, he had blamed himself. Every night, every morning, every lonely hour on that park bench. He had believed he ruined everything. Now another possibility stood before him. Someone had destroyed his life on purpose. And if that was true, then maybe his life hadn't ended after all. Maybe it had been stolen. Clarence closed the laptop. "How much did you lose?" Marshall answered quietly. "Everything." Clarence nodded. "Then let's go get back." At that very moment, several miles away, Vernon Ashford stepped out of a luxury car in Manhattan. He smiled at reporters, shook hands with investors, and walked confidently into a high-profile business luncheon, completely unaware that a forensic accountant had just uncovered the first piece of evidence that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. The hunt had officially begun. For the next 3 weeks, Clarence Abrams barely slept. His office lights stayed on long after midnight. Coffee cups piled up beside his desk. Files covered every available surface. And at the center of it all sat one name, Vernon Ashford. The deeper Clarence dug, the uglier the truth became. What began as suspicious transactions quickly turned into a blueprint for one of the largest financial fraud schemes in affordable housing history. Millions had been moved through shell companies, then millions more, then tens of millions. Every trail led back to Vernon. Marshall visited the office almost every day. At first, he came hoping for answers. Now he came because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. One afternoon, Clarence pointed to a diagram covering an entire wall. Lines connected companies, bank accounts, trusts, and property holdings. It looked less like a business structure and more like a spider's web. "How much?" Marshall asked. Clarence didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his glasses, then looked directly at him. $47 million. Marshall froze. "What?" "That's what we confirmed so far." Marshall slowly sat down. 47 million. Stolen, not lost, not invested poorly. Stolen, Clarence continued. And that's only what we can prove today. The room felt smaller. Marshall stared at the wall. For years he had trusted Vernon completely. He had attended family dinners with him, celebrated company milestones with him, given him access to everything. And all along Vernon had been quietly draining the company from the inside, like termites eating through a house while the owner slept peacefully upstairs. The betrayal felt worse than the financial loss, because money could be replaced. Trust couldn't. A few days later, Clarence made a phone call. One call. That was all it took. The evidence was now too overwhelming to ignore. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation. Federal auditors were assigned. Bank records were subpoenaed. Property transfers were examined. Every shell company was placed under a microscope. The machine began moving. And once it started, nobody could stop it. Not even Vernon. Meanwhile, Vernon had no idea how much danger he was in. He continued living exactly as before. Luxury dinners, private clubs, business conferences, expensive vacations. He believed the collapse of OAE Capital was finished. Ancient history. A dead story. After all, Marshall was broke. The company was gone. The media had moved on. Who was left to fight? Then came the first shock. One Tuesday morning, federal investigators appeared at one of his corporate offices with subpoenas. Vernon smiled confidently. His lawyers would handle it. Then investigators appeared at another office. And another. And another. The smile began to fade. By Friday, 3 banks had frozen accounts linked to shell companies under investigation. That afternoon, Vernon received a call from his attorney. For the first time in years, the attorney sounded nervous. Very nervous. "What exactly did you tell them?" the lawyer asked. Vernon tightened his grip on the phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean they're asking questions they should know to ask." Silence. The lawyer continued. "They have documents." Vernon's heartbeat quickened. What documents? The answer chilled him. Internal documents. For the first time, Vernon felt fear. Real fear. Because there was only one person who could have those records. Marshall. Back in Harlem, Marshall stood beside Nane's food cart watching customers line up. The evening sun reflected off the metal cart. Children laughed nearby. The smell of fried chicken filled the air. His life was still simple, still uncertain, but something had changed. The weight he'd carried for months was beginning to lift, because every day the investigation continued. The truth became clearer. He had not destroyed his company. Someone else had, and soon the entire world would know it. What Marshall didn't know was that the next discovery would be even more shocking, because the investigation was no longer pointing only at Vernon. It was beginning to point towards someone much closer to home, someone whose betrayal would hurt far more than losing money ever did. The call came on a rainy Thursday morning. Marshall was helping Nain prepare chicken before sunrise when his phone buzzed on the counter. It was Clarence. Marshall answered immediately. "Tell me you found something." There was a long pause. Then Clarence said 4 words that made Marshall stop moving. "You need to sit down." Marshall looked at Nain. She saw the expression on his face and quietly turned off the stove. "What is it?" she asked. Marshall didn't answer. He listened, and with every sentence Clarence spoke, the color slowly drained from his face. An hour later, Marshall sat across from Clarence in his office. Several folders were spread across the desk. Federal investigators had uncovered a trust. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Wealthy families created trusts all the time. But this one wasn't ordinary. Not even close. The trust contained over $2.3 million. And the person managing it was Vernon Ashford. Marshall frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Clarence nodded. "It gets worse." He opened another folder. Marshall looked at the documents, then looked again. His stomach tightened. The beneficiary listed on the trust wasn't Vernon. It wasn't one of Vernon's relatives. It wasn't a business partner. It was his wife, Simone Reeves. Marshall stared at the page. For several seconds he couldn't speak. The room became painfully quiet. Finally he whispered, "No." Clarence said nothing. Marshall grabbed the documents and read them again. The dates, the signatures, the transfers. Everything was there. Everything was real. The trust had been established 4 years before the collapse of OAE Capital. For years. Long before the divorce. Long before the banks came calling. Long before Vernon claimed the business was failing. Marshall felt his chest tighten. "You're telling me she knew him?" Clarence folded his hands. "Not only knew him," he tapped the papers. "She trusted him enough to let him manage millions of dollars." Marshall leaned back in his chair. The air felt heavy. Suddenly dozens of memories returned. Private dinners, business events, conversations that had seemed harmless. Times Simone had defended Vernon when others questioned him. Things Marshall had ignored because he trusted both of them. Now every memory looked different. Every memory felt different. Was she involved? Marshall asked quietly. Clarence shook his head. "We don't know." The answer wasn't comforting, because sometimes not knowing is worse. Marshall stood and walked toward the window. Outside, people hurried through the rain. Cars moved through puddles. Life continued normally. Meanwhile, his entire marriage was being rewritten in real time. The woman he had spent 23 years with might not have stolen from him, but she had known things she never told him, and that realization hurt more than he expected. Much more. 3 days later the story exploded. Major newspapers picked it up. Business networks ran special reports. Financial blogs covered every development. And for the first time, Simone Reeves' name appeared publicly beside the investigation. Not as a suspect. Not yet. But as someone connected to the financial structures under scrutiny. That was enough. The damage was immediate. Clients disappeared. Professional colleagues stopped calling. Invitations vanished. Meetings were canceled. People who had once fought for her attention suddenly acted as though they had never met her. The fall was swift and brutally public. That evening, Simone sat alone in her luxury apartment. The television was muted. A news headline displayed her name. She switched it off. Then another notification appeared on her phone. And another. And another. Questions. Speculation. Rumors. The world she had spent years building was beginning to crack. And for the first time, she realized something terrifying. The money couldn't protect her. The reputation couldn't protect her. The connections couldn't protect her. Because when trust disappears, everything built on it starts collapsing, piece by piece. Across town, Marshall stood beside Nane's food cart as customers lined up for dinner. He watched families laugh together. He watched neighbors greet one another. He watched ordinary people living ordinary lives. And for the first time in months, he felt grateful. Not for money, not for success, not for revenge. Grateful that when everything had fallen apart, one person had chosen kindness over judgment. One person had shown up. One person had remembered. What he didn't know was that the biggest shock was still coming, because the next phone call would come from someone who had ignored him for 4 long months. His son. And that conversation would change everything. Marshall was wiping down the food cart when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. Then he looked again. Dorian, his son. The same son who had not called in 4 months. The same son who had chosen his mother's side before hearing his father's story. The same son who had disappeared the moment the money disappeared. The phone continued ringing. Marshall stared at it. Nane noticed his expression. Everything okay? Marshall turned the screen toward her. She read the name. Neither spoke. The phone rang again. And again. Finally, Marshall answered. Hello. Silence. A long silence. Then came a voice he had not heard in months. Dad. Marshall closed his eyes. For a moment, he was back to teaching a 10-year-old Dorian how to ride a bicycle in Greenwich. Back to helping him with homework. Back to family dinners. Back before money complicated everything. Back before success became the center of their lives. Dad. Dorian's voice cracked. I didn't know. Marshall leaned against the cart. The evening crowd continued moving around him. Nobody knew the conversation taking place. Nobody knew a father and son were standing at the edge of a relationship that might never fully recover. What didn't you know? Marshall asked quietly. The trust. Silence. The investigation. More silence. I didn't know any of it. Marshall looked down at the pavement. Months ago, he had imagined this moment. He had imagined anger, accusations, demanding explanations. Instead, he felt strangely calm, because pain had already done its worst. What do you want me to say? Marshall asked. Dorian didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I should have called. Yes. I should have listened. Yes. I should have asked what happened. Yes. Each answer landed like a hammer. Not because Marshall was trying to punish him, because they were true, and truth often hurts more than insults. On the other end of the line, Dorian began crying, not loudly, just enough for Marshall to hear it. The sound surprised him. His son rarely cried, even as a child. Dad, I'm sorry. Marshall looked toward the sky. The sun was setting behind the buildings. Orange light spread across Harlem. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he spoke. I know. Dorian took a shaky breath. You know? Yes. Then why aren't you angry? Marshall thought about the question. Then he smiled sadly. Because I understand. Dorian was confused. What do you understand? Marshall looked at Nane serving customers nearby. I understand that people make decisions based on what they think will keep them safe. The line went quiet. Marshall continued. You thought the money was safe. Another silence. You thought your mother was safe. Dorian didn't deny it, because it was true. Marshall wasn't angry. He was disappointed. But disappointment is different. Anger wants revenge. Disappointment simply wishes things had been better. Can I see you? Dorian asked. Marshall didn't answer right away. For months earlier, he would have said yes immediately. Now he wasn't sure. Not because he hated his son. Because trust once broken takes time. Finally he said, if you want to see me, come to Harlem. Harlem? Yes. Why? Marshall looked at the food cart, then at Nane, then at the line of customers stretching down the sidewalk. Because that's where my life is now. The call ended shortly afterward. Marshall slipped the phone into his pocket. Nane walked over carrying 2 plates of food. One for you, she said. Marshall accepted it. One for me. They sat on folding chairs beside the cart. For several minutes, they ate quietly. Then Nain asked, "Do you think he'll come?" Marshall looked toward the busy street. "Yes." "How do you know?" A faint smile appeared on his face. Because for the first time in his life, he isn't following the money. The next morning, Dorian boarded a train to Harlem. What he would find there would shock him, because the father he remembered was gone, and the man he was about to meet was someone entirely different. The train pulled into 125th Street just after 9 in the morning. Dorian stepped onto the platform and adjusted his expensive coat. He looked out at the crowded station. This wasn't where he expected to find his father. 6 months earlier, Marshall O'Ay had lived in a multi-million-dollar mansion in Greenwich. Today, Dorian wasn't even sure where he slept. The realization made him uncomfortable, because for the first time, he was being forced to see what his father had endured alone. He followed the directions Marshall had texted him and walked several blocks north. The neighborhood was alive. Street vendors were setting up. Music drifted from storefronts. People greeted one another by name. It felt real, unpolished, nothing like the world Dorian was used to. Then he saw it, a small food cart on the corner. A line of customers stretched down the sidewalk. The smell of fried chicken filled the air. Dorian stopped and stared, because standing behind the cart was Marshall, his father, the billionaire developer who once managed hundreds of millions of dollars, the man who used to speak at national conferences, the man whose schedule was booked months in advance. Now he was wearing an apron. His sleeves were rolled up. His hands were covered in flour. And he looked happy. Dorian couldn't understand it. How could someone lose everything and still look at peace? Marshall looked up. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. The sounds of the city filled the silence between them. Customers continued ordering. Cars passed. Someone laughed nearby. Life kept moving. Finally, Marshall nodded toward the cart. "You're here." Dorian nodded. "I'm here." Marshall pointed to a stack of boxes. "Good." Dorian looked confused. "Good." Marshall pointed again. "Those need carrying." For a second, Dorian thought his father was joking. He wasn't. The customers kept coming. Marshall returned to work, leaving Dorian standing there, awkward, unsure, embarrassed. Then something unexpected happened. A woman stepped out from the cart. Nain. She smiled warmly. "You must be Dorian." He nodded. She handed him a pair of work gloves. "Welcome." That was it. No lectures. No judgment. No cold reception. Just welcome. Something about that made Dorian feel even worse. Because kindness is hard to argue with, especially when you know you don't deserve it. An hour later, he was unloading supplies. 2 hours later, he was cleaning tables. 3 hours later, he was taking out trash. His expensive shoes were dirty. His coat was hanging on a chair. His hands hurt. And nobody cared that he had an MBA from Columbia. Nobody cared about his trust fund. Nobody cared about his resume. Here, everyone worked, including him. Around lunchtime, business slowed. Marshall sat beside Jolene, who was doing homework at a folding table. "Need help?" he asked. She smiled. "Actually, yes." For the next 30 minutes, Marshall explained budgeting, savings, and business planning using examples from the food cart. Dorian watched quietly. He had never seen this version of his father before. Patient, present, unhurried. When Dory was growing up, Marshall had always been busy. Meetings, flights, phone calls, deadlines. There had always been another deal waiting. Now he sat beside a teenager, explaining basic finances, as though nothing else mattered. And suddenly Dorian realized something painful. His father had not changed because he lost money. His father had changed because he finally had time to become the man he was meant to be. The realization hit hard. Harder than any headline. Harder than any scandal. Harder than discovering his mother might have known more than she admitted. For the first time, Dorian saw his father not as a billionaire, not as a business icon, not as a provider, but as a human being. And he wasn't sure he'd ever really known him before. That evening, as the last customers left, Marshall began cleaning the fryer. Without saying a word, Dorian picked up a towel and started helping. Marshall glanced at him. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Sometimes the first step toward repairing a broken relationship isn't an apology. It's showing up and staying. What neither of them knew was that the biggest breakthrough in the fraud investigation was only days away. Because federal agents had just uncovered something that would bring Vernon Ashford's empire crashing down once and for all. 3 days later, Vernon Ashford's world collapsed. At exactly 7:12 on a Wednesday morning, a black SUV stopped outside his Park Avenue office. Then another, and another. Federal agents stepped out. Their jackets carried 3 letters that made powerful people nervous. FBI, employees arriving for work froze. Security guards exchanged nervous glances. Phones immediately came out. People started recording. Inside his office, Vernon was reviewing financial reports when the door suddenly opened. His attorney rushed in, pale, breathing hard. Vernon. Something in the lawyer's voice made him stand up immediately. What happened? The attorney didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned on the television mounted on the wall. A news anchor appeared on the screen. Breaking news. Federal investigators have uncovered evidence of a multi-year fraud scheme linked to former executives of OAE Capital Partners. Vernon's stomach dropped. The reporter continued. Sources confirm more than $47 million was allegedly diverted through shell companies connected to luxury real estate developments. The color drained from Vernon's face. No. Then came the sentence that destroyed him. Federal prosecutors are expected to announce criminal charges within hours. For the first time in years, Vernon felt genuine fear. Not concern. Not stress. Fear, because this wasn't a lawsuit. This wasn't a business dispute. This was prison. The office phone started ringing. Then another phone. Then another. Investors. Partners. Reporters. Banks. Everyone wanted answers. Nobody wanted excuses. Within an hour, the building felt like it was on fire. People were distancing themselves. Meetings were canceled. Partnerships were suspended. Friends stopped answering messages. The same people who once praised Vernon were suddenly pretending they barely knew him. The higher you climb through deception, the harder the fall. And Vernon's fall had begun. Meanwhile, across Harlem, Marshall was helping Nain prepare lunch orders. His phone buzzed. It was Clarence. Marshall answered immediately. What's happening? Clarence sounded satisfied for the first time in months. They got him. Marshall froze. The kitchen suddenly became very quiet. What do you mean? I mean they finally got him. Marshall sat down slowly. Years of trust. Years of betrayal. Years of loss. All leading to this moment. Clarence continued. Federal prosecutors have enough evidence to move forward. Marshall looked toward the window. Outside, people walked past carrying groceries and coffee cups. Life looked ordinary. Yet everything had changed. When Marshall asked, "Today?" Marshall closed his eyes. For 6 months he had replayed every mistake, every signature, every decision, every conversation, wondering how he could have been so blind. Now the truth stood in front of him. He hadn't lost everything because he was careless. He lost everything because someone he trusted had deliberately stolen from him. The burden he'd been carrying finally began to lift. That afternoon, news stations across the country carried the story. Vernon's photograph appeared everywhere. Financial fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The list of charges seemed endless. Then another name started appearing in reports. Simone Reeves, not as a defendant, not yet, but as someone connected to several financial structures now under investigation. By evening, social media was flooded with speculation. Former colleagues refused interviews. Law firms distanced themselves. People who once admired Simone suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. The silence around her became deafening. As the sun began setting over Harlem, Marshall stood outside the food cart watching customers leave. Nain handed him a cup of sweet tea. "You okay?" Marshall looked at the crowd, then at her, then at the sky. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. Not because Vernon was suffering, not because revenge felt good, but because the truth had finally caught up with a lie. And truth always travels farther than people think. Nain smiled. "You look lighter." Marshall laughed softly. I think I am. What he didn't know was that the biggest surprise of all was still coming. Because within days, money that everyone believed was gone forever would begin finding its way back. And that would give Marshall an opportunity to build something far greater than the empire he had lost. 6 months later, a crowd gathered on Frederick Douglass Boulevard in Harlem. Television cameras lined the sidewalk. Community leaders stood near the entrance. Food vendors filled the street with the smell of spices, grilled meat, fresh bread, and fried chicken. Above the entrance of a beautifully renovated 3-story building was a sign that made people stop and stare. Thibodeau, OA Community Kitchen. Nane's name came first. Marshall insisted on it, because he never forgot who had shown up when everyone else disappeared. The building had been transformed into something special. The ground floor housed food stalls for small entrepreneurs who could not afford expensive storefronts. The second floor contained a commercial kitchen where vendors could prepare food legally and professionally. The third floor offered business training, accounting assistance, and mentorship programs for local families. It wasn't just a building. It was an opportunity, a second chance, the same thing Marshall had been given. As the ribbon-cutting ceremony began, reporters surrounded him. One journalist asked the question everyone wanted answered. Mr. OA, after losing billions of dollars and getting back only a fraction of it, do you ever wish you could return to your old life? The crowd became silent. Marshall looked at the building, then at Nane, then at Jolene standing proudly beside her mother. Finally, he smiled. No. The reporter looked surprised. No. Marshall shook his head. I spent years building wealth. He paused. But I forgot to build a life. The crowd listened carefully. When I had money, I thought success meant being important. He glanced toward Dorian, who was standing nearby wearing an apron and helping vendors prepare for opening. Then I lost everything. Another pause. And that's when I discovered who actually cared about me. Many people lowered their heads, because they understood exactly what he meant. Marshall continued. The people who leave when your money disappears were never in love with you. The people who stay when you have nothing are the people you build your life around. Nane wiped a tear from her eye. Marshall turned toward her. 10 years ago, I helped a stranger because it felt like the right thing to do. He smiled. I never expected that stranger would someday save me. The crowd applauded, but Marshall wasn't finished, because there were lessons he wanted everyone to remember. Life lesson from Marshall's story. First, never confuse admiration with love. Many people will celebrate your success. Far fewer will stand beside you during your struggles. Learn the difference early. Second, character matters more than credentials. Vernon had degrees, experience, and a powerful title. Nane had a food cart and a handwritten recipe. One destroyed lives. The other restored them. Third, kindness is never wasted. Marshall forgot about the $200 he gave away. Nane never forgot it. A single act of kindness can travel farther than money ever will. Fourth, trust is valuable, but blind trust is dangerous. Good people trust others. Wise people verify. Never stop paying attention to what carries your name. Fifth, your worth is not your bank account. Marshall lost billions. Yet the most meaningful chapter of his life began after the money was gone. Sixth, success without relationships is an empty victory. Money can buy comfort. It cannot buy loyalty. It cannot buy family. It cannot buy genuine friendship. Those things must be earned. Finally, the people who remember your kindness are your real wealth, not investments, not properties, not titles. People, always people. As the ribbon was cut, the crowd erupted into applause. The doors opened. Families walked inside. Vendors welcomed their first customers. Children laughed. Music played. And for the first time in a very long time, Marshall felt complete. Not because he had recovered money. Not because Vernon had gone to prison. Not because his reputation had been restored. But because he had finally learned what his father had been trying to teach him all along. The difference between making a living and building a life. Thank you for watching Super Stories. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories filled with powerful lessons. And tell us in the comments, What was the biggest life lesson you learned from Marshall and Nane's story? Until next time, stay blessed and keep choosing kindness.